Hey guys, I want to talk to you a little bit about everyone's favorite topic, loneliness. And so it's interesting during this season of life, I find that extroverts are talking about how this is just a nightmare, having to be quarantined, not be able to see people. I think especially if you're single and an extrovert and you're living alone. I have a great deal of compassion for you. And then it's hilarious because my introverted friends think that Christmas has come early. And so they're telling me, hey, I have so much energy. I'm like, good for you. Our souls are dying over here. The extroverted souls are dying, but you have a lot of energy. It's just funny. And I really am grateful that you introverts can get filled up. So more power to you. Awesome. But today, this isn't just for single people who are living alone. This is just for anybody struggling with loneliness. And that can be, the reality is that we all struggle with loneliness at some level, just because no one can understand fully our own experience of just what it is to live and walk and breathe on this earth. And so that's just more like the existential loneliness that we all feel at some point or other. I will say that I think it's probably going to be really highlighted over the next month how much we might struggle with loneliness, because the reality is that we were created for community, because we were created in the image of God, male and female. And the image of God, if you think about the Father, Son, and Spirit, C.S. Lewis talked about this, and I learned a lot of this about the Trinity. So much I've learned from Larry Crabb's teachings, where he talks about how the Trinity is like a living, spirited dance. So if you think about how the Father, Son, and Spirit are, if you think of them in a circle, they're pouring out for the good of the other. They're a community. They are the only non-dysfunctional family that's ever existed. And because we were created in that image of God, of a community, that we are also made for community. But there are also moments in our life where community isn't available in the way that we would want. And sometimes that's a gift, because it surfaces things in us that are difficult and hard and that we need to look at. And other times they can help alleviate and relieve some of the pain that we feel just because of the loneliness of life. And all of us experience different types of loneliness. But I'll tell you what, I'll never forget the first time I really was aware of how deeply I grappled with loneliness. I had been out of college for about a year, and I had just gotten broken up with, had a broken engagement just not long before our wedding. And I moved back home in with my parents. So I'd gone from great community to a broken heart, and then moving back in with your parents. So that was a good time. Parents are great. They were wonderful when I did that, but still, it's tough times moving back in, and I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. But what I did know is that the missionary lady, author, Elizabeth Elliot, was going to come speak in my hometown. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to go hear Elizabeth Elliot. If you don't know who Elizabeth Elliot is, just Google Elizabeth Elliot. Goodness, at the time I saw her, she was probably her early 80s. She passed away, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. But she has an amazing story about being single and being in love with this man who said he felt called to singleness, and so waited 5 years before they got married. And then when they got married, he was killed. He was a martyr as a missionary in Ecuador. And so then she remarries and he dies. Her story, Anyway, I had carried copies of her book under my arm all throughout college, Passion and Purity. Yeah, carried it around like it was my Bible. And so, it was just really popular at the time. Anyway, I went to see Elizabeth Elliot speak. And she talked about suffering, and she said that the definition of suffering is having what we don't want or wanting what we don't have. And for me, the epitome of suffering during that season was loneliness. And so I'm like, I'm going to go take my copy of Passion and Purity and have Elizabeth Elliot sign it, And I'm like, I'm sure she's just going to have a lot of compassion for where I am. So I stood in line and waited and waited. And I got up to her and she was like, hello. I'm like, hi. And I just started crying, telling her my story. And she's like, I mean, that's what, there was nothing. She's terrifying. She's terrifying. She is a godly, wonderful woman, but she was terrifying. Anyway, she did sign my book, Passion and Purity, and somebody borrowed it, and I want it back. I want it back, whoever you are. Anyway, but that definition stuck with me about suffering as it related to loneliness. Loneliness was something that I had that I didn't want. And I thought everybody else in the world wasn't lonely and they had what they wanted. And so what it did was begin to reveal like different entitlements that I carried that I didn't even know I had. But let me touch on this really quickly, is that there actually are different kinds of loneliness. And so I learned some of these, just my own experience, but also I heard Tim Keller talk one time about loneliness. And he made the comment that there's a loneliness that we experience at times. One of the types of loneliness is just from our own sin, our own disobedience. And we just feel that distance. A second type of loneliness is that the loneliness comes upon us through our circumstances, but it's not necessarily our fault. So like right now, we might be struggling with loneliness, but it's not necessarily our fault. We've got to be quarantined to our homes right now. So it's circumstantial. A third type of loneliness comes from being a minority in a majority culture. And that can be a variety of things. Like if you're Asian American right now in the US, that right there is a type of loneliness that our brothers and sisters are carrying that we can try and empathize, but we don't really get it. So that's a type of loneliness that we can observe and we can try and ask questions about and speak into so they don't feel as invisible. A fourth type of loneliness comes upon us through our obedience and courage. And this is the loneliness that comes just from following Christ. And loneliness really does prepare you for leadership because leadership is lonely. It's interesting because I just thought the loneliness used to be something that we just needed to get rid of. When actually, what does it look like to move from loneliness to solitude? And so I was looking up some scriptures and then just trying to think through what is the difference between loneliness and solitude. And so I was looking at all the definitions of lonely in scripture, and there really aren't that many. But in Psalm 25, it says, "Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I'm lonely and afflicted." And what the psalmist is saying is, hey, it's just me here. Do you see me? Will you turn to me? Will you be gracious to me? And you see that time and again in the Psalms of a crying out of a request to be near. How long is this going to go on? And God does draw near. But like I said yesterday, there's also Psalm 88 where it doesn't end in praise. Sometimes that waiting and the suffering of loneliness and that tension is longer than we would like. Another definition of lonely is it literally means wandering alone, just kind of wandering alone. Can feel a little aimless or feel a little lost, and you want somebody else to find you so you can feel some sort of substance, like I'm here, I'm grounded. But the opposite of that is solitude. So could our loneliness actually be an invitation to solitude in order to grow in our intimacy with God? And if you're like me at different times in your life, you're going to hear this and you're going to be like, I don't want that. I'm sick of that. I know the truth of that. I'm weary. Can you please give me something else other than that? I get it. And reality is I can't give you much else. I can't, because I believe that is what's true. And we have to wrestle through and grieve and the things that we desire that we don't have. And I believe that squeezes things out of us, which I'll get to in a minute. Say you're proud of me for writing all these letters backwards in order for you to be able to see them correctly. I had to practice a little bit. Anyway, but solitude, loneliness is a keen awareness of our need for connection, whereas solitude, it's invitational It's welcoming. It's not something to be avoided, but it's something that our soul actually really craves. Really craves. Yesterday I talked, if you want to go back to Facebook and look at my Facebook Live, I talked about the 8 core emotions. And one of the ones that I talked about was loneliness, and how actually there's a gift from God in our loneliness, but there's also an impairment. When we don't acknowledge our loneliness before God, it shows up with a sense that life is meaningless, isolation, self-pity, shows up, as pride. Like, it's so hard for me to let people know that I'm alone and I'd like to do something, but nobody's calling, and I'm not calling anyone, or if I am, then people already have plans. It hurts my pride, so I can tend to isolate more instead of risking to do that. And I'm just wondering how you are impacted when you don't offer your loneliness to God or admit that it's there. Okay, let me share this a little bit. So a couple of years ago, I was meeting with Buddy Odom, who he is just dear to me. He's a pastor to pastors, and older wise man, like this big mustache and just kind of this burly guy who just loves people really well, but he's a straight shooter. And so I knew when I met with Buddy to talk about this issue of loneliness, which is just a continued theme, that it might be a lot like telling Elizabeth Elliot my story, but Buddy was way more loving. But as I sat there talking with him about my struggle with loneliness,